Greetings! If you have found your way to this video and you do not already know who I am, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lachlan Nicholson. I'm a white male South African in my late 20s, and this is part 1 in what will most likely become a playlist detailing my perspective on the current state of South Africa as seen by someone on the inside. I don't expect that this content will reach a great number of people, because the things that I have to tell you are decidedly unpopular in the current era. But I'm making these anyway for the sake of posterity, and so that if things come to the worst, I will at least know that when they did, I was not silent. The story of South Africa in 2019 is long and complex, which is why it cannot all be explained in the course of one recording. The various issues we face will also be difficult for someone of a Western upbringing to understand, unless they have personal experience with the structure of African society, because African society in many ways runs contrary to Western reason and logic. These recordings will not be visually dynamic, because my purpose here is to share important information, not to entertain you with fancy visuals. At the outset, I would also like to explain that if you happen to find my speech pattern unusual, it is because I live with quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and among other things, the disability has an impact on the way in which I am able to speak. And now, let's get on with part 1. In order to have any hope of understanding the current situation in this country, you must first have a basic understanding of our political landscape. So that is what I will endeavor to provide you. South Africa is a nation in which many small political organizations exist, but the three main ones, which constitute the power players across the nation, are the African National Congress, which is our current ruling party and has been since our first democratic election in 1994. Then we have the Democratic Alliance, which is the party that most closely aligns itself with what would be considered traditional Western values. And finally, we have the Economic Freedom Fighters, a party that is more akin to a gang of radical communists than an actual viable political movement. Now, if I wanted to, I could literally sit here for hours and catalogue for you the multiple failings of the African National Congress, but in the interests of my sanity and your time, I will summarize by saying that since seizing power in 1994 under then President Nelson Mandela, the ANC has presided over a slow and continuous decay in the standard of living and safety for all South Africans. The prevailing narrative in post-apartheid South Africa is still very much one of black versus white, and this is something that is consciously and actively driven by the ANC themselves. They do so in order to maintain their hold on power and to obscure the fact that the truth can be more closely described as a narrative of the few versus the many. What I mean by this is that despite all their grand talk of equality, and a better life for all. What the ANC has essentially been able to do for the past several decades is to institute a system where a privileged elite, who are generally black, are given advantages and opportunities denied to the vast majority of ordinary South Africans, who also happen to be mostly black. Those within the halls of power care little about whether their actions are legal or illegal, as long as the result is that they will be enriched. As a consequence, crime and corruption run rampant, and on an almost weekly basis, news breaks of one scandal or another in which vast amounts of public money have been stolen by politicians who seek only to further their own lavish lifestyles. A prime and topical example of this is something known as the Zondo Commission, which is a judicial investigation into whether or not former President Jacob Zuma colluded in trying to hand over control of South Africa's entire economy to a family of Indian businessmen known as the Guptas. A defining characteristic of African politics, which is absolutely crucial to understand before you can understand anything else, is that in these situations, personal friendship will almost always be prioritized over allegiance to the laws of the land. If a particular individual or group is favored by those in power or happens to have some incriminating dirt on them which can be leveraged, then no matter their own criminal misdeeds or violent actions, they will be supported and looked after regardless of what they do or have done. Simply put, such is the African way. There is no purpose or point in questioning it or trying to complain, because that's just the way things are. I will now move on to telling you a little more about the other political players. As I mentioned earlier, the Democratic Alliance, or DA, has been the most traditionally Western political party in the South African landscape. The policies for which they have been known to advocate have generally been of a classically liberal, capitalist nature. Sadly though, as the old membership ages and is either ousted or leaves of its own accord, and the DA descends into petty power struggles, it is beginning to resemble the ANC more closely with each passing week. To bring part 1 to a close, I will now tell you about the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF. The Economic Freedom Fighters are led by a man called Julius Malema. Malema is a radical who got his start as the firebrand chairperson of the ANC Youth League. The culpability of our mainstream media in his rise to prominence as a political figure cannot, in my opinion, be understated. They are to blame because they liked the fact that he was willing to say outrageous, attention-grabbing things. So they paid him a lot of attention, and therefore allowed him to gain a massive following in a relatively brief amount of time. And this man actually has no business leading a modern political movement. He and his many followers are extremely fond of portraying themselves as revolutionaries, ready and able to enact the will of the people. What they are in reality is a gang of violent thugs who are willing to employ any and all means, including violence, to achieve their aims. The very fact that Malema felt compelled to go out and start his own political movement came from a disagreement he had with former President Jacob Zuma over Malema's feeling that the ANC was not radical enough in its redistribution of what Malema feels is white wealth. Malema's similarities to brutal African dictators of the past are striking and eerie. And what's even more frightening than the man himself is that thousands of ordinary South Africans buy into the idea that he is selling. Even as South Africa stands at the current moment, with most of our public services either bankrupt or on the verge of it, and crime at an all-time high, if the EFF were ever to be elected to the seat of power, that would truly signal the end of this nation as we know it. And with that, we come to the end of part 1 of the state of South Africa. I hope that this content has brought some value to your day, and if so, please consider showing me some support. You can do so by picking something up from my merch store or supporting me via PayPal or Patreon. For now, farewell.